Rohan, welcome to the Future Melbourne podcast.
Thank you.
Rohan, if you had 30 seconds, what are Arden and Macaulay and why should people care?
You're asking a former Melbourne City councillor to be brief, very brave. Arden and
Good
Macaulay are the most significant urban renewal areas in the City of Melbourne. They're going to see more new residents, new homes, new jobs than any other precinct in the City of Melbourne between now and 2050. So that's where government's attention is, to make sure that it succeeds and that we're building livable communities for the future.
So let's talk about the orientation itself. Where exactly is Arden and Macaulay?
So Arden and Macaulay are north of the Western Branch railway lines, and Macaulay straddles either side of CityLink and the Moonee Ponds Creek. Arden includes a large area of land still owned by the state government surrounding the new Arden station. Arden Street straddles Arden. It's mostly industrial land, although it's started to heavily transfer to residential, especially in Macaulay.
And what differs between Macaulay and Arden? What springs to my mind when I ask that question, obviously, is in Arden there's a lot of vast empty land at the moment, a lot of it's government owned. Macaulay, there's a lot of building that we're seeing already, isn't there?
Yeah, so Macaulay's almost entirely privately owned. The main exception there is the public housing towers, which is owned by the government, but obviously already developed. Arden is, the majority is still state government owned. There is quite a bit privately owned on the periphery, but the entire, the largest blocks of ex-industrial land, ex-railway land owned by the state government around the station. So the main differences between planning for Macaulay and Arden is that in Macaulay, government's trying to set the planning controls and the market will respond. In Arden, the government's trying to do that, but on top of that, they also have this ability to influence the outcome through selling the land.
Let's walk us through the history of these places, their identity, and of course the spine that largely separates them being that Moonee Ponds Creek. Talk us through your understanding of the history of both places, from the First Nations landscape to that industrial landscape to where we are today.
Yeah, so it's a long and layered history. Conscious I can't tell all of it.
Of course.
But before European settlement, the land was dominated by a creek, but it wasn't a permanently flowing creek. So at the bottom of the chain of ponds was the Great Blue Lake. Many of your listeners might have heard of this concept. David Sornick has a great book about the pre-settlement history and what the area used to look like. But it was a really, really short number of years after Melbourne was first settled that this area became the dumping ground for Melbourne. And all the way through from the 1830s to the 1890s, the land became where all of the most noxious trades were located. And so it's been industrial since the start of settlement, but that first layer of industrial heritage was all of the nasty stuff that the good burghers of Melbourne wanted to put slightly out of sight.
Is that why the current Lord Mayor describes Moonee Ponds Creek as the most neglected waterway in Melbourne, or abused waterway in Melbourne?
Well, I can't speak for him, but that is certainly part of the history. There are other layers since then, of course. So, famously, the CityLink freeway goes right over the top of that creek. The creek was straightened when the freeway went in. The levees first went in the 1890s, and they were updated again before that actually, they were updated when the upfield line was built in the 1890s. So there's been a lot of trying to recalibrate the direction of the creek and control the waters, especially in times of flood. But the next massive change, of course, was that CityLink, which straightened the creek and made it really quite ugly. All of the good stuff that's happened since then, all of the biodiversity that's returned to the creek corridor is because of local resident volunteers. And special credit to the Friends of Moonee Ponds Creek, who are almost entirely responsible for making it as beautiful as it is again today.
So why is Moonee Ponds Creek both the big opportunity and the big headache of these two precincts, do you think?
Yeah, so Moonee Ponds Creek, where it intersects with these urban renewal areas, and there's Docklands in there as well. So Macaulay, Arden and Docklands they're all of their most developable sites are barely a couple of metres above sea level. Most of the developable sites, even up in Macaulay, don't get past about 10 metres above sea level. And when there's a lot of water in the Yarra, when there's a lot of water in Victoria Harbour, king tide plus a lot of rain, the water can bank up, right? So the Moonee Ponds Creek could be beautiful, could be the lifeline of these areas, but it is also the bottom of a pretty significant catchment, and all the way upstream has been paved and developed, and the water runoff only ever has increased over the decades. Then when you start to factor in climate change and predict more rain in future and higher sea levels, you've got to really think carefully about how you're developing Arden, Macaulay and Docklands. And there's a reason why Arden and Macaulay haven't been rezoned for residential until quite recently, haven't ever seen residential development, with the exception of some of those Kensington homes, and that's because it floods.
So let's break the two up, just to help people understand the two precincts in their own right. Arden Station being the catalyst for Arden. We'll get into Arden first. A lot of people would understand the area at the moment, I suppose, by the North Melbourne Football Oval. But more recently now, there is a new metro tunnel station that is at the centre of Arden. But as I mentioned before, there's a lot of empty space surrounding that metro tunnel station. So what does success look like in renewal precincts like Arden, with homes and jobs, parks, schools and street life, when we're talking about it as a blank canvas right now, do you think?
Well, you just said it. It needs a mix of all of those things, but it needs a plan that's costed and funded and committed to deliver them. And what we've got at the moment is not that bad. I mean, I'd much rather be in the Arden situation than the Fisherman's Bend situation, because you've got the heavy rail right in the middle of the precinct, which can be a catalyst for development. And it's going to be much harder to retrofit that in places like Fisherman's Bend later. So Arden's got a lot going for it, and it's already got really, really good transport connections. The biggest barrier it's got to developing any of the other stuff, all of the buildings and all of the new roads that are going to be needed, is the drainage situation. So while the state government figures out how to sell the land and how finally it needs to divide up that land to produce certain design quality outcomes, it's also thinking about who's going to have to pay for the main drain. And we're at the pointy end now of some negotiations with the shortlisted parties. There were 4 parties shortlisted to purchase the entirety of the state government-owned land around the station back in 2024. And probably in the first half of this year, well before the state election, the state will provide an update as to where it's gotten to with those negotiations. And we'll see the extent to which the onus will be placed on the winning consortium to build a lot of this stuff, including all of the drainage that's going to be so important, including profit-generating residences. But what are those anchor tenants going to be as well? Who's going to build some of that community infrastructure? Where's it going to go exactly? So a lot of these questions are tied up in these negotiations with the parties that are bidding to buy the land.
And you've talked about the current context where we find ourselves today with Arden, but rewind a little bit. What was the original promise of Arden? How have those plans changed in recent years?
And they changed a lot, and I think they're going to change again, but it's hard to predict. So the Arden Structure Plan 2021, which is not the first iteration of the plans, talks about an innovation hub. It also talks about 34,000 jobs or thereabouts and 15,000 dwellings. By 2024, through the negotiation with potential buyers, that number had crept up to 20,000. But whether it needs to creep up again and those planning controls will be revisited is a big open question now. The biggest hiccup along the way was this brilliant idea from the state government to locate a campus of the Royal Melbourne Hospital within walking distance of the station. And it's well known now why that hasn't gone forward, the electromagnetic interference. And so there's still this question as to who are the anchor tenants going to be? Is it enough to just have a station and sell the land and build a whole lot of homes? Or can the government still manage to attract some anchor tenants that really get this precinct developed as quickly as possible?
So many critics have warned about a Docklands-style risk in Arden. You touched on it before with the current context where we find ourselves today with Development Victoria going out to tender for a renewal of the precinct in a sort of monocultural capacity, I suppose. What does that actually mean in practical terms when people make that criticism?
Well, let me put it all in the prism of the size of the block of land that you're trying to sell. So the larger it is that the precinct that you're selling, and the more control you're giving over to the buyer to dictate the built form that they want to produce, the less ability government has to require a fine grain, high quality, visually interesting precinct. Now, the Arden planning controls that are in there now do require fine grain, resolution, interesting visuals and all the rest of it, but the reason you've got that interest in the central city is because the blocks of land were very, very small when those interesting buildings were built, whereas in places like Docklands and now in Arden, the scale of the land being sold is much, much greater. Now, there are ways of dealing with this, but the biggest risk about design and whether the new community is going to feel interesting or whether it's going to feel sterile is what are you imposing on the buyer to keep it interesting. So I'm sure the state will be looking at things like multiple buildings with different architecture firms attached to each. We'll be looking at making sure that the lower levels of the buildings are proposed with really high design resolution so that the architect's in there right from the outset, rather than just fixing the facade as the building's being built. So there are tricks, but it's still a risk.
What does Arden still lack today in terms of real neighbourhood needs? And that question might sound silly given the fact I mentioned it's largely empty space at the moment, but the motivation behind that question, I suppose, is inspired by the many stories from coming out of the community about the demands for more schooling pressure in the area. So it sounds like there's a lot of planning work to go in the interim in order for all this fine grain to be better understood in terms of the complex stuff around what Development Victoria is doing with its tender and all that. But how immediate are those pressures, and can some of that stuff come before some of the housing components in Arden, do you think?
Well, theoretically, yeah. I mean, I think it's more difficult now than ever before to do that, given the financial constraints the government's currently in. But the most difficult part of this is that we're not talking about one school, we're talking about multiple schools. And if you're not sure if you're planning for a precinct of 15,000 residents or 25 or 30,000 residents, you're not sure how many schools you need to build, you're not sure how much land you need to reserve. And so it's, on the one hand, we're in this state 10 years after Arden started being replanned, where we're not sure what the capacity of the precinct's going to be. On the other, there are very good reasons why they're in this situation, and since COVID and the cost of development and the difficulty it is to build high density buildings and apartments does mean that the only way the government is going to sell this land is if it rethinks and renegotiates what the developers can get out of it.
And it goes to the heart of that criticism about Docklands 2.0 in this respect, doesn't it? Because here in Docklands, in inner city urban renewal precinct, probably Melbourne's first, Docklands primary school is already over capacity.
Yeah.
It's flowing into the district Docklands shopping centre with a temporary campus. There's still no plans in place for a secondary school. So if they don't get these things right in Arden, first and foremost really, then you could risk the same sorts of things happening.
That's absolutely right. And so Macaulay, which I know we'll switch to as well, which was a council-led urban renewal area, whereas the Arden precinct was a state-led urban renewal area. The council's been really, really keen to try and set the density cap up front, not just for the entire precinct but for individual sites, so that it knows what community infrastructure to build, what the road capacity is going to be, how many schools are going to be required, and how much open space is going to be required to keep that population healthy. If you've got the density and the capacity of the precinct in a really unpredictable state, you can't do any of those things with confidence, and it becomes really expensive decades down the line to try and retrofit, squeeze in another school. Do you have to purchase a developed land off a private developer in order to do it? Like that stuff just gets really expensive.
We've seen that before in Fisherman's Bend with parks, for example, where they've had to purchase very expensive land off developers.
That's right. And so open space is going to be every bit as important in Arden and Macaulay as it is in Fisherman's Bend, possibly more, because the open space is going to have to serve that two functions: mitigate floods and hold some flood waters in times of flood, but also provide that high amenity recreational space for tens of thousands of new residents. I mean, you've got to have that amenity.
Let's talk about housing. It's a huge issue amid the housing crisis at the moment. Here in the City of Melbourne, the state government's housing statement forecasts, I think, at least double the number of homes in the City of Melbourne by around 2050. So it's about 150,000 more homes. The urban renewal precincts around the city are obviously the places where those sorts of opportunities will need to be capitalised on for that sort of housing to be realised. Again, this conversation will interlace across both Arden and Macaulay as we continue, but in Arden, again, it's empty space. Macaulay's slowly building out, or quickly building out by some people's estimates. But is affordable housing as a concept? We talk about housing, but what type of housing? When we're talking about these 150,000 homes, how achievable do you think a desirable amount of affordable housing will be to achieve in a precinct like Arden with given the current planning context?
Well, it'll be difficult without the tools to require it. So on the one hand, you've got this simple supply and demand equation, which says that the more homes we've got, the more of a lid we can put on rising costs. And so supply is really important. I'm not going to pretend it's not. But it is also really expensive to develop medium and higher density housing development, especially in infill areas inside the metropolitan area at the moment. Some of those costs have really grown exponentially since the start of the pandemic. So you've got to figure out what's viable in a development sense, but also what the requirements of the future populations are going to be, and strike that balance when you're deciding, are you going to impose an affordable housing contribution? Now, Victoria's always been really timid about that, and whereas some other cities around the world have just built in a 30 or a 50% inclusionary zoning rate, half the homes need to be X% below market value, rent or buy. We've done nothing like that in Victoria. Australia is not great in a global context, but Victoria is especially lagging. But you need to apply these requirements broadly in order to get fairness across the system. And we just aren't close to having that at the moment. Now, the state government's currently looking at 60 activity centres in metropolitan Melbourne, and they're going on that first silo I've been talking about, supply, and hopefully some of that will help produce affordable homes. But just like those activity centres don't look like they'll be having any mandatory affordable housing requirements built into them, so too does it look like Arden and Macaulay won't have that either. So the exception to that will be whether the state requires, when it sells the land that it owns in Arden, that 10% of those homes become affordable, and the government has repeatedly said that that's what they're looking at trying to do. But we're not but this isn't world-changing stuff, right? Like we are really lagging on affordable housing.
If you could hardwire 3 things into Arden now, what would they be?
Look, I know it's not very sexy, but I'm going to start again with the thing you can't even see, you need a main drain.
One.
We're not going to see the precinct succeed until we've solved the drainage problem. I think the open space needs to come with development, not after, and so that's my number 2, and that is linked to the drainage question as well. In Macaulay, we've actually already seen half of the developable sites actually develop, but none of the open space implemented yet, and again, there's lots of reasons for that, but we're getting into the situation where, half of the 10,000 residents in Macaulay now are living there but don't have the open space and won't have it for some years yet. And so that does some unfortunate things about community and public health. So I hope that Arden, which does actually have quite a lot of open space promised, that the government can find a way to ensure that that open space is built at the same time as the residential development, not years after. And the third one you've mentioned already, the schools. You've got to have the schools at the same time, not decades after, because not just because children need a place to go, but because it will fundamentally change the residential mix of the precinct. People don't buy into areas if there is no school for the kids to go into. Some will and just cop the transport burden, but if you want these precincts to succeed, you need the amenities that are going to attract the families, and you need the services that are going to attract the families, and so that open space and schooling question has to come with development, not after. There are other sorts of development that could come a few years after, but parks, schools, they are number 1.
Let's jump to the other side of Moonee Ponds Creek now, to Macaulay. As we've touched on already, there are, in terms of development, already things happening there. There's buildings going up. There's a different vision under the Macaulay structure plan as opposed to the Arden structure plan. But touching on some of the points that you've just raised and some of the things you'd like to see hardwired in Arden, which of course also relates to Macaulay, is what residents in Macaulay have often described as a complexitron. There's a lot of governance arrangements along Moonee Ponds Creek, but there's also different arrangements, as I understand, in terms of who the agencies that are leading Macaulay as opposed to Arden. So could you first of all just touch on how is Macaulay different to Arden in terms of how it's being led?
Yeah, so Macaulay is mostly private land. The most contentious bit where ownership is in conflict at the moment is the VicTrack owned land on the western bank of Moonee Ponds Creek. Doesn't have any railway infrastructure on it, but it is owned by VicTrack. VicTrack can't just gift that land to another arm of government or to local government. And so the process of deciding how the funds will be raised to purchase that land so that another part of government can develop that land and build flood mitigating open space for the community is really, really complicated. And it's not just a recent problem, it's actually over 100 years since one of the biggest floods in Kensington, which is quite devastating for the low-lying lands on the western bank of the creek. Some of the floodgates along the levees were broken. The Railways Authority owned the land but disavowed any responsibility to maintain the flood mitigating infrastructure. So actually we've seen well over a century of dispute between different bits of government as to who actually is responsible for flood mitigation and who's actually the owner. Like, these are two separate questions, and the Railways Authority, or VicTrack now, has been central to that for over a century. So that's the complicated ownership piece, but there's also, of course, some natural conflict between the council and the state government as to who leads the planning of the area. So what are the expectations and what are the limitations on all of that private land, and where are the new roads going to go, where are the parks going to go, and how are we going to raise the funds to pay for it. So the council's always been the lead authority for Macaulay, but planning reform in Victoria is a fast changing thing. The shiny program of the moment is the activity centres program, which the government will want to see completed by well before the state election. And so there's pressure on the council now to conform with that shiny program and make sure that the new controls in Macaulay align with those activity centre controls. And so that's why we've recently seen a bit of an intervention by the planning minister to once again try and influence what the council's doing to produce a particular result.
So you've just spoken to a few there, but the existing community in Kensington, before any of these new residents in Macaulay have even moved into some of these new builds, can you summarise what some of the issues are that they've been contending with for such a long time?
Yeah.
In addition to that, the existing residents who are living in Macaulay, and you've sort of alluded to it with open space challenges. So try to paint for people that, yes, all this stuff is a complexitron, as some people describe it. How does it impact people in real terms?
So it's difficult for me to talk about this objectively, because one of the reasons I ran for public office back in 2012 was off the back of consultation on the then structure plan, the Arden and Macaulay structure plan. And that was adopted before I was elected, and the planning controls won't be adopted until well after I've gone. I've already gone, so that's how long this process can take. But right from 2010, 2011, when the council first initiated these big public discussions about the future of Macaulay and what do we want to see here and what's its capacity and where should the parks go, is a consistent call from the Kensington community to say, do the parks first and then the people will come. Do it in that order. Now, fast forward to 2026, half of the developable sites, as I've said, have been developed. That new open space hasn't been delivered yet for very complicated reasons. Some of them are legal planning questions that haven't been resolved yet, and hopefully they'll be resolved this year. But there's an element in the community of I told you so, and frustration and concern that all of these sites are being developed without the open space to keep them healthy. And the Kensington community is pretty pragmatic. This is really near the central city, right? It's easy in this day and age to try and paint any constructive criticism of a proposal as blocking or NIMBYism. But the Kensington community has always been supportive of converting the industrial land to residential land. They've just been calling for certainty about how that's going to be done. They want to be sure that in times of flood, the land's been designed to withstand that flood and keep people safe, and they want the parks, right? So that hasn't happened is disappointing, but it's not the fault of any one individual.
To allow you one more opportunity just to emphasise how critical drainage is in these areas, why do drainage and flood mitigation basically dictate everything in Macaulay?
Yeah, so
it's not a sexy topic as you mentioned before, but it's worth emphasising, I think.
No, I mean the last really scary flood was the Christmas flood in 1963, and the reason that was so scary is that came well after the construction of the levees and well after the construction of the first pumping stations. And there are people who live in Kensington who remember that event. When government looks at land that doesn't have homes on it, and they're not local or embedded in that knowledge and history and don't remember when the creek tends to flood at certain times, they might see the opportunity for redevelopment, and they might even see the opportunity for not a profit making, that's the wrong way to look at it, but something that doesn't cost the government. You know, it looks like a logical place to house people so close to the city. But there's a reason that the land hasn't been developed. A lot of the homes in the Kensington side, when they were developed in the 1880s and 1890s in the first wave, weren't really meant to be developed at all. The council had actually placed a prohibition on building, but they were developed anyway. And so this is a problem that's not new. It's a problem that's going to grow because of climate change in future. And that's why you have to plan these areas, not just in terms of housing capacity and where the homes are going to go and how many there are, but how high above the ground floor how high above the actual land does the ground floor have to be? If that's really, really, really high, are you going to end up with entrances that are way above the street level and really ugly streetscapes? We don't want that. We don't want too much of what we've seen on Stubb Street. You want high quality design, but that's why this isn't like any other activity centre. It's right at the bottom of the water catchment, and you've got to design to keep people safe. You've got to design so that it's visually appealing, and those things aren't simple. Those things aren't fast. And when there's a tussle between two levels of government as to what the best solution is, it takes a very long time to resolve those questions.
Before we get into some recent political context, can you explain in simple terms what is a structure plan and why do we need it before the buildings? I think it's important to emphasise this when we talk about an Arden structure plan, Macaulay structure plan, which I think in the Melbourne planning scheme is C417. Is that correct?
That's the amendment that implements the structure plan. Yeah.
There you go.
So, and it's confusing because we call these amendments after the structure plan.
Yes.
And this new advisory committee, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute, is also called the Macaulay Structure Plan Advisory Committee. But we actually have the structure plan. It was adopted in 2021. It replaced the old Arden Macaulay structure plan, which was adopted in 2012. So
in simple terms, it's a master plan?
Yeah, it's a master plan for the area. It proposes at a high level what the planning scheme amendment will consist of, so how the land use controls are going to change, the zoning, those overlays, where the open space should go, where the new through block links, the footpaths, the streets should go, and in this case as well, what the charge on each dwelling or floor area should be to help pay for some of that infrastructure. So the structure plan says the planning scheme amendment should have all of these things, but the thing that's been a protracted dispute is the detail of the planning scheme amendment, and so that still hasn't been resolved. Hopefully it'll be resolved mid-year.
So let's jump to that recent political context I alluded to before. On the front cover of one of our hyperlocal news publications, the Northwest City News, just in the past couple of weeks, being our February edition, we led with the story, planning shock. Council had previously voted to send C417, which you've just outlined, to an independent panel. In December 22, the Minister establishes a state-led advisory committee under Section 151, essentially pauses C417 and drafts replacement controls. Their hearing scheduled for April, I believe.
Yeah, April.
So what exactly changed and why does this matter for ordinary residents, these complicated planning changes?
So all these questions about how the planning scheme amendments can be resolved are live questions. I'm no longer an elected rep, so I'm going to be a little bit reluctant to tell anyone what they should or shouldn't do. But to try and answer your question at the end there, it was a surprise, but you can understand where the planning minister's coming from.
Mm-hmm.
So in the entirety of the cities of Melbourne and Yarra are designated an inner Melbourne activity centre, so one of the 60 activity centres, but they're different to a small precinct. They're vast swathes of land, so there's a big question about how you go about replanning those areas. The Minister wants to ensure that the Macaulay precinct is leading the way there and is an example of these new activity centre program proposals. And so the main change, it looks like, is going to be the controls that the council drafted will be translated into the controls that are being used in other activity centres. Whether there's going to be a material difference in terms of land use and in terms of capacity, heights, density, setbacks, that sort of thing, we don't know yet because the new controls haven't been published. They're just being considered by this advisory committee. Now, by the time this chat is out there, maybe that question will be resolved and some of this stuff will have been published, but we don't know yet how to predict what's going to happen yet. But again, you can see what the state government's trying to do. They're trying to ensure that there's as little unnecessary consistency across the state in its urban renewal areas and its activity centres as possible. And so it's asked for these right near the end of the process for a review again of how all these controls are written.
So what's the difference between an independent planning panel and a ministerial advisory committee in terms of transparency and fairness?
So an independent planning panel, you know what they're going to consider, and they have to apply procedural fairness to everything that they do. The Activity Centres Advisory Committee will try and do that as well, but an independent planning panel, anyone who made a submission, basically has a right to be heard. The advisory committee process is deliberately designed to fast track a whole lot of that. It can put questions on the papers, and as I said, it doesn't appear that this question of whether or not the matters it's considering need to be published has been answered. I hope they'll be published at some point. I think that's just a logical thing to do, and it's the sort of thing that conveys confidence and accountability and transparency, and so it's always a good thing to not be too secretive about how these questions are going to be answered. So they're the main differences. In a panel, the council retains a special status. It's the planning authority, it's the proponent for the changes in all these controls. But that's a bit blurrier here because at the end of this advisory committee process, we're not sure if the council will prevail, if the Department of Transport and Planning will prevail, and what the minister will do with all of that advice. So it's just, we're just in a little bit of a period of speculation and uncertainty, and there are lots of local residents who are naturally concerned about that and are hoping that the resolution is going to produce really high quality results.
Yeah, can you explain the local concerns from the Kensington community and frustration, I suppose, given it was a long drawn out process just to get to that planning panel that we have just unpacked. Now there seems to be a new process that is unwinding, and also, as you allude to, whether there'll be any material differences between that former process and that new process is obviously cause for concern for the community, who have contributed so much to this process over a very long time.
It is the time that's the issue here, because unlike a normal planning process that rezones a greenfield site, you come up with a structure plan or a precinct structure plan proposal, you follow it up with a planning scheme amendment, and the whole process can be done in a couple of years. This is now a 16-year process. This isn't the first time the planning controls have changed. The first time was in 2017. And it's become so complicated that it is really difficult for your local resident who doesn't have a planning degree or a law degree to try and understand and follow what's going on. In spite of that, the residents who have been there from day dot, and in fact who have been there their entire lives, have been broadly consistent about what they've been asking for. And right up until a few weeks ago, they've been able to see where things are up to because they've all been published. The change now is that these final questions about how Macaulay's planning controls can be resolved might be done without those controls being published, and that would be unfortunate, but it's why I think some of the residents are feeling a little bit left out, justifiably so.
Is it fair to say with half, or more than half, I think by some estimates, of Macaulay's land already being developed, is this the definition of planning paralysis?
No, I think you've got to look on the other side of the river for that. But I'm optimistic and I'm confident that we can still get a good result here. Like, it's really, really, really hard to develop these areas, as I've said, and that water question I don't think is quite being given the highest priority that it needs to be given. But look, it's an election year. It is in the government's interest, it's in the council's interest, it's in landowners' interests to resolve the questions about the final form of the Macaulay controls and the Arden controls, for that matter, quite quickly. The process that the minister's set up will seek to resolve these questions by May, June, July perhaps, and we'll see what comes out of that. Has there been some paralysis along the way? Yes, but there's lots of reasons for that, and I think the biggest hiccup along the way was actually the proposal of the East-West link, which we haven't even talked about. That put a hold on Macaulay planning for 2 or 3 years. A state government of a different political persuasion proposed a twin freeway on the western bank of the Creek to match the CityLink raised freeway on the eastern bank. Now that would have not made Macaulay a desirable place
and that project's worth mentioning isn't completely dead either politically.
Well, now I'm not going to comment because he did not run for election, Sean, and I'm quite enjoying observing the planning process, but I'm not going to speculate who's going to win. I'm not going to speculate what their policies are going to be, much as I'd like to.
But you're still optimistic that this new process can produce good outcomes for Macaulay?
You've got to be optimistic.
Yeah, that's good.
You've got to be optimistic. What else have you got? That's planning.
And
That's why I love planning.
And let's talk about what we are seeing in Macaulay, because there's a lot of build to rent. What's your honest take on build to rent in renewal precinct? Solution, symptom, or both?
Well, build to rent promises a new type of development, but if you scratch the surface, what you're looking at is just a more commercial type of residential development. It is also, unfortunately, a type that evades having to pay certain development charges. So because a build-to-rent building doesn't need to be subdivided, you don't need to pay the open space levy, which can sometimes be really considerable, and local government relies on that to then build the parks that can serve the population that is being facilitated by that new building. And so there's a big question about the capacity of the council to cater for that growing population if they don't have the funds to acquire land and upgrade land for parks. And then there's this difficult to measure question as to whether or not developers are choosing that land, choosing that development type because it evades that charge. And is it really what the market's asking for? I think it has a place, and in part of a big housing mix, and if that's what developers want to build in the state we're in, where it is actually development of higher density apartments is more marginal than it has been for a long time, then you've got to support it at some level, but not at any cost, not at any cost. And some of the apartments that we're seeing, especially in Macaulay, they're not below market rate. Sometimes they're considerably higher. So I wouldn't call it a luxury housing product, but it's not the it's not the solution to the affordable housing crisis that some are saying it's going to be. Not yet, anyway. It would need to be more heavily regulated if it's going to be part of that solution.
Given mandatory affordable housing is off the table under the current advisory committee structure in Macaulay, and given that context that you mentioned of what's being built there isn't necessarily affordable, what are the remaining pathways to get or achieve affordable housing in Macaulay?
Well, very interestingly, the Parliament in December amended a bill that rewrote the Planning and Environment Act 1987, so the biggest reforms in 30 years. And there's a clarified head of power for affordable housing in there. Now, there's a big question as to how that's going to be used, but in future it's possible, depending on how the regulations are going to be drafted, that government will have more tools to go back and mandate some affordable housing requirements. Without that, we've got voluntary systems. And we've seen in Macaulay, and we might see in future in Arden, we're certainly seeing it across the metropolitan area, including in activity centres, this opt-in affordable housing pathway, where if you provide 10% of homes for a certain period of time to a registered affordable housing provider or below market rent, usually 30% below market rent, suddenly some of those mandatory controls become discretionary and the minister becomes a decision maker, and you can get a bit of a development bonus, right? One of the options though is a 3% of the construction cost charge. So you don't have to actually produce any affordable housing on site, but you can chip in a not very substantial sum into a statewide affordable housing fund and still get that development bonus. So there's a big question as to whether or not that's appropriate in urban renewal areas. The council in the past has said that it's not. You've got to actually establish the expectation up front. You've got to build it into the density cap. But as you said, that's been taken off the table for this advisory committee process, and I think it's going to be some time until we see how the new powers in the Planning and Environment Act will be used. Certainly that won't be resolved before the Macaulay planning controls are resolved.
So where to from here? With a sense of practical optimism in mind, we're talking about two different precincts, one creek with two very different governance models but similar stakes. So what must happen in the next 6 to 12 months? What should residents watch out for? And let's touch on Macaulay first in that respect. What are the three non-negotiables for Macaulay's future controls that we should be looking to set the tone for in the next 12 months, shall we say?
Well, certainty on those development charges will mean that the council can start spending the funds that it's already collected. It's collected about $25 million from Macaulay developers, and that starts to pay for some good open space. So resolution of that development contributions charge question is going to be really important. The other stuff we're not going to know until we see what the department's drafted to translate the council's controls into the state government controls. So I'm not sure what 2 and 3 are going to be. Perhaps, the question will be whether it is a policy neutral translation or whether this has, in hindsight, just been an opportunity to subtly increase some of the capacity and help meet those municipal housing targets and the 151,000 homes that you referred to earlier. I hope that's unlikely. I hope it's a policy neutral translation. I think it's important that the council takes a municipality-wide view of this stuff and doesn't just outsource to the advisory committee the question of what the capacity of Macaulay should be, because that's going to have implications for the rest of the City of Melbourne, and that should be a question that's vested in elected representatives. I'm a stickler about that stuff. And open space, will we have everything we need to time the construction of some of these spaces?
And for Arden, you've already touched on 3 characteristics that you'd like to see hardwired into the precinct, but what are the next decisions that will shape the precinct for the next 30 years, do you think?
Yeah, well, if it does get resolved in the first half of this year, which may happen, we'll know which consortium has won the bid to purchase the land and build a whole lot of stuff, and who will then be responsible for that drainage infrastructure. And if it's tremendously expensive, which it will be, is there going to be compensation for that, a review of the planning controls and the capacity of the precinct? There are planning controls in there. They're pretty discretionary at the moment. The big question will be, are they going to change, or is there going to be an understanding that that discretion will be generous? Because this is really big stuff. This is going to be one of the biggest contracts that the state government has to land in the short term. So that's going to dictate a whole lot of stuff in future. Second, is land going to be reserved for one school or more schools? And third, will that flood mitigating open space come with development or after development? Obviously, I would argue that needs to come with, because it's not just an amenity thing, it's a safety thing.
If you could leave our listeners today with one key message to take away, what should they understand about how cities or urban renewal precincts like this get made?
Well, it is very complicated, but one thing we haven't talked a huge amount about today is the value of the knowledge that isn't found in published recent reports by government, but is found in the memories of the local residents. And whilst, again, it looks like land that doesn't have people in it, it's just really interesting industrial land. That's not the case. Government studies and reports can't always accurately reflect, and had government had its time again, had council had its time again when I was there, I'll take responsibility for this as well, it might have done better to formalise that community engagement process and really unleash the important, not just interesting, but essential knowledge that the residents of North Melbourne, West Melbourne and Kensington hold, because government has neglected the creek, government has neglected this area. There aren't voters in it, and so the political imperative to pay attention to it hasn't been there for much of the 20th century. But the guardians of that area are the local residents, and
places are about
knowledge
people.
is much more valuable than those drawing lines on a map might first realise.
Rohan, thanks for joining us today.
Pleasure.